They called the house on the edge of Whitcomb's grazing fields the Hollow because the wind hollowed it out like a bone. Maggie Thorne had lived inside those hollow walls for 7 years, counting the hours between chores, the bruises, and the silences. The careful measurements of how to survive inside someone else's law. At 38, she was older than the girls who came and went through Whitcomb's service. Older than the favors other women were expected to give in exchange for food. She had come to work after James's, her husband, died hand-splitting, steered fence posts for neighbors, and then for Whitcomb, until a fever took him in a night too cold to get a doctor. The Whitcombs had been kind enough to take her in, so the story went. Kindness had a price there. She was a servant who knew the numbers of a household. How many bolts of cloth? How long a roast could go in the coals before it burned? How to stitch a child's shirt so no one would notice the mended seam. She could read the ledger margins more easily than the sermons that called her to bow her head. She learned to set bones in the dark with the same care she used to braid a horse's mane. The men who hired her called those skills useful and tended to forget they belonged to a woman who had once been a wife with a name that exacted history rather than servitude. The first thing Whitcomb took away was her husband signed promissory his assurance that he had paid a debt. It was a small paper fluttering in the wind on the day James died. Whitcomb said it was a lost promise. The second thing came quietly, her reputation. When she refused the first of the house's late-night attentions, the kind that arrived with a swagger at the foot of the stairs, she found herself finger-blamed for a missing brooch. Accused of stealing from a house that watched her sleeping like a hawk. Maid against mistress. Widow against inheritance. For a while, she moved through the kitchen with a cord of rage wound tight around her ribs until it frayed into planning. On the night she fled the Hollow, she carried only 2 things. A patched dress she could shove into a satchel and the town ledger she had leaned over for years, taking notes about who owed what, who had paid in kind, who had signed for hay and had not returned the favor with wage. She stole what she had watched for 7 years. The trail of Whitcomb's favor, ledger crooked rents, unpaid wages, a dozen steps that told a different story than the public one. If she could make some noise with those pages, something larger than Whitcomb's half-smiles maybe, people would listen. She ran from the Hollow as the dawn slipped gray across the prairie. She kept low, knowing the way the sun cut across the fields and where the fence corners gave shelter. She did not get far before a bullet grazed the corn stubble near her boot. The sound lifted her heart into a raptor's flight. A hooded rider dropped out of the cottonwoods like a ghost and used a voice that was a different kind of kindness, rough, not quick to claim. "You lost something, ma'am?" the rider asked. He spoke without the leers and sugar that made Whitcomb's men smell like old citrus. He wore a dark hat. His eyes were tired in a way that matched her own. She could smell smoke and old rain on him. He called himself Silas Crowe, which was a name she would come to know like the taste of strong tea at night. For now, it was only a fact. He was an outlaw. Word came loose like a coin wanted for theft and for a run-in with the county marshal. He sat like a man who had been doing wrong long enough to be careful about doing right in the barn. As thunder mused in the distance, she found him slumped against a bale of hay inside a loft. He was bleeding in a place along his ribs where a bullet had made its house. The light slanted through the slats and caught his jaw like a carved stone. He could have been another danger, another hand ready to take advantage. Instead, when he saw the ledger pressed to her chest like a talisman, his face changed. Something like respect slid across him. He didn't reach for her, didn't offer the coarse comfort of men who had owned women like a pair of gloves. He looked at her and listened. Those small things mattered to someone who had been cataloged by Whitcomb's household as a hand. Not a person. Maggie could sew a wound that kept a man from collapsing. She could set the broken finger of a hired hand and hold a child through fever without flinching. She undid her shawl, folded it to make a compress, rooted in her satchel for whiskey and clean scrap linen. While she worked, she tended the ledger with the same careful hand, smoothing creases, closing margins, noting names. Silas watched the penmanship of years of unobserved labor. Woman's invisible history built into the margins of other people's wealth. He knew then that she was no ordinary servant. He began his silence like a promise. He'll keep her secret if she would keep his, she decided. Then and there, to accept his help. Not because she had no other choice, but because he offered a trade that suited the woman she had become. Shelter in exchange for skill. She would tend to his wound with competence that had been honed on the shoulders of someone else's life. He would hide her from the men she had escaped like a shadow would hide a shape. It was a dangerous bargain. It was also a workable one, as the rain threaded the air and Whitcomb's lanterns burned like accusations. Maggie felt something uncoil inside of her. The ledger was no longer only a map to her past. Loss as it had become a possible map to her future. She wrapped the bandage around Silas's chest with the same hands she had used to tie rope for hay bales. Each knot was a vow. She would not be broken by a past that had been handed to her. She would lift herself by the tools she knew: stitch, ledger, care. If the law would not listen, she would turn to the law of survival that she had practiced in the hollow. The outlaw beside her might save her body. She would save the rest with the ledger and the steady, stubborn intelligence that had kept her alive so far. Silas slept with his jaw clenched, throat working as if the air itself were a bargain. Maggie watched the rise and fall. The way the sun carved a stripe of gold through the loft and lit the thin scar along the back of Silas's hand. She had lived in rooms with laundresses and seamstresses who remarked that the hands were the truths of a person. And Silas's were worn but honest. When he opened his eyes, he apologized not for being wounded, but for the danger he had brought to her barn. "We ought to be strangers," he said, voice like gravel under leather. "But you're no stranger to trouble." She didn't give him the kind of answers men in Whitcomb's house had expected, a head bowed and willingness. Instead, she told him what she knew. Names slipped off her tongue. Ledgers, debts, Whitcomb's, signatures. She told him not with a plea, but as an inventory of wrongs, as a woman cataloging what she would need to reclaim. It was a plan, rough at its edges. She'd collect statements from those who had been wronged. Kay'd present the ledger as proof. They'd force the county to investigate. It was reckless and maybe naive and required courage. She hardly yet claimed for herself. Silas surprised her by offering skills in return that weren't strictly about violence. He had been a courier of sorts, a man who had learned channels. He could ride without a compass and find people who preferred not to be found. He knew where the Whitcombs kept certain accounts off the books, how the sheriff looked the other way in exchange for favors. He had been on the other side of injustice before, cornered by men with badges who took more than they should. So his plans were practical, pragmatic, and shaded by wariness. Their alliance deepened in small acts. Maggie boiled water and laid poultices. Silas kept watch at the loft stair, listening for the thud of boots that might mean Whitcomb's men searching the marsh. When a patrolling rider came near the barn, Silas led the alert of a crow's harsh call and pressed his back to the hay, letting the muscles of secrecy settle into his spine. Maggie taught him where to bind well to prevent infection, how to make a salve from lard and comfrey that would make a heap of difference in a wound that could otherwise fester. He taught her how to ride the colt that had been born in the Hollow's paddock, how to feel the animal's temper, how to squeeze rather than yank. They escaped a search because of her quick thinking. Whitcomb's men came one dusk, their horses snorting, boots shaking damp straw from the floor. The ledger was hidden beneath the floorboard under the pantry. Maggie had learned the tricks of the kitchen for reasons of survival. Silas had the steadiness to keep his breath even while she sent her feet, quick and sure, into the dark to pull the floorboard loose and stuff the pages into a sack that smelled of flour. She could taste the fear on the back of her teeth, but also an exhilaration. This was the first time she had taken something from her oppressor that wasn't a scrap of hope. As the men left, Silas whispered, "You knew exactly what to do." The praise warmed her, not because she needed someone to validate her, but because he saw her as an architect of survival rather than a salvageable piece. His respect became a currency of its own. She was not merely hiding. She had become an active participant in crafting her safety. She tended the small brightness of a candlelit table where they planned and mapped and sometimes bickered like equals. When she was exhausted, Silas would give her the small space, no questions. Just freedom to sleep, and when he was feverish, she wouldn't hesitate to rough his hair into a bandage. Their conversations, at first strictly transactional, began to uncurl toward the shape of two minds measuring each other. Silas asked about the ledger's origins, not to own the story, but to protect it. Maggie listened to his stories, brief flashes of a childhood in a mining town, of injustice at the hands of men who wore the law like armor, and she found herself sharing more than strategy, the ache of being watched, the memory of James's laugh, the hollow in her chest that loyalty had left behind. They stitched trust with small stitches, his refusal to take the ledger off her hands, her refusal to accept his money when he offered it to pay for supplies. They survived because they both offered what they had, and both refused to hand over what made them human. Silas had guns, but he used them sparingly, preferring to outwit a foe when possible. Maggie had knowledge not only of medicine, but of the ledger codes that told where money moved. She could read the patterns of Whitcomb's giving and the names people whispered when they bargained away favors. It was that knowledge, her competence, that started to reframe the way Silas saw her. She wasn't someone to hide or protect. She was someone to listen to. That week in the barn was a crucible. Maggie's hands grew steady as she stitched. Silas's plans grew patient as he watched her read the ledgers. They did not fall for each other. Then romance did not flash like lightning in their loft, but something like a promise took root, too stubborn. People agreeing that they would not let the world decide their fate. When they rode out together to gather the statements Maggie needed, Silas at her flank and her eyes steady on the road, she felt the stirrings of an unimagined word partnership. It would not be the kind that belonged to the hollow. It would be something built of choice, mutual risk, and the hard-earned respect that comes from watching someone take the blows and keep giving. Back the valley they hid in was the kind of small bowl in the earth where wind softened its bite and willow roots drank deep. There, in a cabin borrowed from a friendly trapper named Harlan, Maggie found a kind of slow reclaiming. She set a small herb garden by the window and planted comfrey, yarrow, and lavender, the same herbs she had used on Whitcomb's table when she could steal moments between chores. Each morning she tended the garden with a patience that felt like prayer. Her fingers, once bent by scrubbing and starching, began to remember how to coax life out of the soil. The plants rewarded her. Silas watched as she arranged dried herbs in cloth sacks. He learned to call them ammo for healing rather than comfort. In the days that followed, Maggie's skills unfurled into new formats. She set up a clandestine medicine chest in a trunk that had once belonged to a trapper's wife. She started to stitch small repairs for neighbors who would otherwise wander to Whitcomb's house to trade a favor. When a boy from the next homestead came in with his arm bent the wrong way, Maggie didn't just treat the bone, she set it straight and taught the boy how to wrap it. She trained him to complain loudly when someone tried to take advantage of him. It was work that made something click in her chest. She could fix things other people thought permanent. The cabin became a safe house in more than one sense. Women whose wages had been withheld. Laundry girls with children and no one to sign their papers. The midwife from the other side of the ridgewall visited under the guise of trade or barter. Maggie tended them not only for the ailments of the body, but for wounds that couldn't be bandaged, reputations stained by lies, marriages twisted by greed. A girl who had been taken by a man who promised marriage and left her with a baby and nowhere to sleep. Women spoke in the hush of shared secret. And each confession added to Maggie's ledger of grievances and resolve. She started keeping her own records now, separate from Whitcomb's crooked pages, where Whitcomb's ledger tracked debts as pawns. Maggie's notebook recorded names and stories. Mrs. Petrie, who had lost harvest wages to Whitcomb's demand for storage. Tom Hargrove, who never received his share of cattle sale. Sarah, the kitchen girl who'd been accused of theft only after she refused to be Whitcomb's entertainment. The rhythm of recording became a therapy of sorts. Maggie knew that the law could be slow and that a paper pile meant a lifetime of listening. But she also knew evidence had a slow, steady power more exacting than a fist. Silas's presence leaned into the edges of her life. They bickered over the best use of rags for poultices. She showed him how to whittle a splint to avoid splintering. He taught her how to read the night sky for travel and where to hide horses, so that tracks looked like random hoofprints. He never assumed labors like caring for the guests were hers alone. When an older woman, Nell, who had lost her boy to an unpaid wager, arrived with a bag of nails and a promise, Silas hammered, and Maggie planned where the testimony would do the most good. He never dictated who spoke when. He amplified the voices she'd curated, helped find a sympathetic ear in the stall. If you want a couple of questionable ingredients, if you're using a scanner, a complaid of a scanner ep, and it's like a scanner, standing like scanner, look at this, look at this. And we all know I've been exploring. And we scanned as I've still cord to see as I've stepped out at the scanner. It's can lead me with unsquast, with squays can as if stay with sick cast fide we you, with neighboring town's trading post where a clerk with a soft mouth named Henry Wood copied down statements. She began to make choices she had not allowed herself to make years prior. She chose to keep a portion of a barrel of flour for the women who passed through who had no claim otherwise. She chose to keep the ledger safe beneath loose floorboards in Harlan's cabin instead of the hollow of her satchel. Each choice layered confidence like planks across a gap she had feared would swallow her whole. She started to speak in the rooms where decisions were made not loudly or with bluster, but with the precise language of someone who had counted every cost. When Silas suggested they lie low and wait for the heat to pass, Maggie argued for action gentle, methodical, and unescapably hers. There were nights near the wood stove when she allowed the shape of things undone to come into the open. She poured a small measure of whiskey for Silas and herself and told him the truth of the Hollow's nights, the way Whitcomb's smile had been used like a brand, the way small cruelties mounted into an architecture of control. I am tired of being the thing that happens to others, she said. He listened like the earth, kind and patient. Then don't be, he replied. And for the first time, she felt someone tell her to be something else without taking that something from her romance. When it came, did not arrive as fire, but as embers, the small, warming things that allow a cold heart to think of spring again. He respected her boundaries without question. He deferred to her decisions about the ledger. He stood beside her in the market when she gathered statements, as respectful of her trade as he would be of a cattle sale. He learned to tend her wounded pride with the same skill he used to watch for riders. She, in turn, taught him to stitch small wounds in his ribcage of memory. To trust that someone could hold a hand without owning the whole. Their partnership grew from the mortar of mutual competence and quiet affection, neither seeking to rescue the other. They escaped a search because of her quick thinking. Whitcomb's men came one dusk, their horses snorting, boots shaking damp straw from the floor. The ledger was hidden beneath the floorboard under the pantry. Maggie had learned the tricks of the kitchen for reasons of survival. Silas had the steadiness to keep his breath even while she sent her feet, quick and sure, into the dark to pull the floorboard loose and stuff the pages into a sack that smelled of flour. She could taste the fear on the back of her teeth, but also an exhilaration. This was the first time she had taken something from her oppressor that wasn't a scrap of hope. As the men left, Silas whispered, "You knew exactly what to do." The praise warmed her, not because she needed someone to validate her, but because he saw her as an architect of survival rather than a salvageable piece. His respect became a currency of its own. She was not merely hiding. She had become an active participant in crafting her safety. She tended the small brightness of a candlelit table where they planned and mapped and sometimes bickered like equals. When she was exhausted, Silas would give her the small space, no questions, just freedom to sleep, and when he was feverish, she wouldn't hesitate to rough his hair into a bandage. Their conversations, at first strictly transactional, began to uncurl toward the shape of two minds, measuring each other. Silas asked about the ledger's origins, not to own the story, but to protect it. Maggie listened to his stories, brief flashes of a childhood in a mining town. Of injustice at the hands of men who wore the law like armorand, she found herself sharing more than strategy, the ache of being watched, the memory of James's laugh, the hollow in her chest that loyalty had left behind. They stitched trust with small stitches, his refusal to take the ledger off her hands, her refusal to accept his money when he offered it to pay for supplies. They survived because they both offered what they had, and both refused to hand over what made them human. Silas had guns, but he used them sparingly, preferring to outwit a foe when possible. Maggie had knowledge not only of medicine, but of the ledger codes that told where money moved. She could read the patterns of Whitcomb's giving and the names people whispered when they bargained away favors. It was that knowledge, her competence, that started to reframe the way Silas saw her. She wasn't someone to hide or protect. She was someone to listen to. That week in the barn was a crucible. Maggie's hands grew steady as she stitched. Silas's plans grew patient as he watched her read the ledgers. They did not fall for each other, then romance did not flash like lightning in their loft, but something like a promise took root, too stubborn. People agreeing that they would not let the world decide their fate. When they rode out together to gather the statements Maggie needed, Silas at her flank and her eyes steady on the road. She felt the stirrings of an unimagined word partnership. It would not be the kind that belonged to the hollow. It would be something built of choice, mutual risk, and the hard-earned respect that comes from watching someone take the blows and keep giving. Back the valley they hid in was the kind of small bowl in the earth where wind softened its bite and willow roots drank deep. There, in a cabin borrowed from a friendly trapper named Harlan, Maggie found a kind of slow reclaiming. She set a small herb garden by the window and planted comfrey, yarrow, and lavender, the same herbs she had used on Whitcomb's table when she could steal moments between chores. Each morning she tended the garden with a patience that felt like prayer. Her fingers, once bent by scrubbing and starching, began to remember how to coax life out of the soil. The plants rewarded her. Silas watched as she arranged dried herbs in cloth sacks. He learned to call them ammo for healing rather than comfort. In the days that followed, Maggie's skills unfurled into new formats. She set up a clandestine medicine chest in a trunk that had once belonged to a trapper's wife. She started to stitch small repairs for neighbors who would otherwise wander to Whitcomb's house to trade a favor. When a boy from the next homestead came in with his arm bent the wrong way, Maggie didn't just treat the bone, she set it straight and taught the boy how to wrap it. She trained him to complain loudly when someone tried to take advantage of him. It was work that made something click in her chest. She could fix things other people thought permanent. The cabin became a safe house in more than one sense. Women whose wages had been withheld. Laundry, girls with children, and no one to sign their papers. The midwife from the other side of the Regil visited under the guise of trade or barter. Maggie tended them not only for the ailments of the body, but for wounds that couldn't be bandaged, reputations stained by lies, marriages twisted by greed. A girl who had been taken by a man who promised marriage and left her with a baby and nowhere to sleep. Women spoke in the hush of shared secret. And each confession added to Maggie's ledger of grievances and resolve. She started keeping her own records now, separate from Whitcomb's crooked pages, where Whitcomb's ledger tracked debts as pawns. Maggie's notebook recorded names and stories. Mrs. Petrie, who had lost harvest wages to Whitcomb's demand for storage. Tom Hargrove, who never received his share of cattle sale. Sarah, the kitchen girl who'd been accused of theft only after she refused to be Whitcomb's entertainment. The rhythm of recording became a therapy of sorts. Maggie knew that the law could be slow and that a paper pile meant a lifetime of listening. But she also knew evidence had a slow, steady power more exacting than a fist. Silas's presence leaned into the edges of her life. They bickered over the best use of rags for poultices. She showed him how to whittle a splint to avoid splintering. He taught her how to read the night sky for travel and where to hide horses, so that tracks looked like random hoof prints. He never assumed labors like caring for the guests were hers alone. When an older woman, Nell, who had lost her boy to an unpaid wager, arrived with a bag of nails and a promise. Silas hammered, and Maggie planned where the testimony would do the most good. He never dictated who spoke when. He amplified the voices she'd curated. Helped find a sympathetic ear in the neighboring town's trading post where a clerk, with a soft mouth named Henry Wood, copied down statements. She began to make choices she had not allowed herself to make years prior. She chose to keep a portion of a barrel of flour for the women who passed through, who had no claim otherwise. She chose to keep the ledger safe beneath loose floorboards in Harlan's cabin instead of the hollow of her satchel. Each choice layered confidence like planks across a gap she had feared would swallow her whole. She started to speak in the rooms where decisions were made not loudly or with bluster, but with the precise language of someone who had counted every cost. When Silas suggested they lie low and wait for the heat to pass, Maggie argued for action gentle, methodical, and unescapably hers. There were nights near the wood stove when she allowed the shape of things undone to come into the open. She poured a small measure of whiskey for Silas and herself and told him the truth of the Hollows nights, the way Whitcomb's smile had been used like a brand, the way small cruelties mounted into an architecture of control. "I am tired of being the thing that happens to others," she said. He listened like the earth, kind and patient. "Then don't be," he replied. And for the first time she felt someone tell her to be something else without taking that something from her. Romance, when it came, did not arrive as fire, but as embers. The small, warming things that allow a cold heart to think of spring again. He respected her boundaries without question. He deferred to her decisions about the ledger. He stood beside her in the market when she gathered statements, as respectful of her trade as he would be of a cattle sale. He learned to tend her wounded pride with the same skill he used to watch for riders. She, in turn, taught him to stitch small wounds in his rib cage of memory. To trust that someone could hold a hand without owning the whole. Their partnership grew from the mortar of mutual competence and quiet affection, neither seeking to rescue the other. Silas stood with her as she rehearsed. He offered tactful counterpoint, slight adjustments to ensure the sheriff could not dismiss the ledger as a common forgery. He said, "We need a man with a steady hand at the market to copy this over and someone in the clerk's office to take it seriously." He was not trying to lead. He was adding the precision of a man who had learned how to move around a law that ate people who moved wrong. Maggie nodded, laying out tables for each witness and checking for weak spots in the story. She refused to be sentimental about anything less than thoroughness. The plan unfolded like a careful harvest. They secured Henry, the clerk at the trading post, who had a soft mouth but a hard will. He agreed to copy 3 ledger pages and to attest to his handwriting should someone attempt a later forgery. He wanted to keep his shop's good name clean too. He had seen Whitcomb's favors sway men he'd trusted. Maggie paid him with a jar of molasses and a promise of the truth. Women who had felt wronged by Whitcomb were offered food and cover so they could attend without fear of retaliation. Silas and Maggie did not use his criminal past to frighten them. They used it to show that sometimes those who had been outside the law understood how to gather evidence within it. But truth does not always stride into a town unopposed. Whitcomb and his men learned the language of threat. They tried to buy witnesses, offering coin and fake favors to the laundress, the stable boy, even Henry. Men get used to being lips for sale, and Whitcomb's coin rattled like a temptation. A frightened witness took the money and turned against Maggie at the last minute. And the deputy, the same man who had arrested her, showed up in the clerk's office with a badge of threat and a smirk. He tried to cow her with the implication that certain women make trouble for themselves when they speak ill of respectable men. It was one of those small cruelties. He wore his authority like a glove that reddened Maggie's hands. She prepared again. This time she called Nell and Sarah and a few others who had not been bought. She asked them to swear and to tell the truth, not with hatred, but with the steady resolve of people who had had enough ruled by the convenience of wealth. "We will not be silenced because a man has more coin," she told them. "We will not trade our names for his favors." They agreed with the kind of private courage shared between women who've learned to survive together, Maggie's. plan became not an eruption, but a methodical unveiling. The ledger pages were examined, the letters of Whitcomb were cross-referenced, and an account of owed wages and favors was pinned like a bird to the town's notice board. The complaint she filed was careful. It demanded an audit, not a rush to spectacle. She understood the law required evidence, and that men who wore the law often dismissed what they disliked. She also knew that if Whitcomb's corruption was exposed to the public, those who had turned away to the convenience of silence might begin to speak. Her fight was not merely personal. It was about preventing other girls and women from being folded into the kind of invisible labor Whitcomb had built. She wanted the law to weigh impartially, not because the law was blind by default, but because it needed to be made too. Silas worked the fringes. He kept watch on the deputies' comings and goings. He intercepted a letter that suggested intimidation and translated it into proof of corrupt practice. He stood by when she had to stand before a few men with a ledger and her mouth polite but ironclad. Every time Whitcomb's men tried to silence her, she planted another name on the ledger. Every time a witness wavered, she found the courage to coax them back. She did not take the fight lightly. It took the sort of energy that had kept her alive inside the hollow, cautious, deliberate, and stubborn. Her truth was no longer a coal in her chest that burned her alive. It became an ember she bore into public view and used to kindle others' courage. When people finally read the direct correspondence, Whitcomb's promises and deeds that did not match the town started to stir. The law could be slow, but it could be made to hear when the air was thick with undeniable proof and the resistance had to be public. Her fight was hers, and she fought it with allies she had chosen. She had not needed Silas to force her into a heroic role. She had chosen a tan, the outlaw, beside her, learned to respect that choice. When the sheriff finally summoned Whitcomb to account for his ledgers, Maggie felt a quiet triumph that was not about vengeance, but about reparation. She had carved a place for herself in the world that Whitcomb had tried to make small. It was not yet the end of her story, but it was the beginning of an unmaking of the life that had been imposed on her. There are alliances that glitter and alliances that root. Maggie and Silas's was the latter, deep set with fibers that held through turbulence. As the town's interest in Whitcomb's ledgers grew, so did the complexity of their actions. They worked together as a team that valued each other's strengths equally. Silas, who once used his cunning for opportunistic theft, now used it for strategic misdirection, diverting Whitcomb's men when needed, intercepting letters, learning the timing of the deputies' patrols. Maggie, whose competence lay in organization and truth-telling, prepared affidavits, lined up witnesses, and planned the public revelation like a general placing her forces. They did not romance as a curtain call to the plot. Their affection deepened in the trenches. Silas learned the value of the ledger's slow power. Maggie learned the usefulness of small deceptions when used for a greater good. When Whitcomb hired henchmen to intimidate witnesses, Silas suggested they use a decoy route to draw the men away long enough for Maggie to secure a crucial statement. "You lead," he said. And she did not because he wanted her to be the face of struggle, but because she chose it and because he respected her capacity for the risk. They became a study in mutual growth. Maggie taught Silas to use his hands for more than evasion. She showed him how to sew a terribly torn shirt for a boy whose father had been paid off, how to craft a poultice from the chamomile they'd grown, how patience in tending a wound could be as powerful as a shotgun when victory was measured by a life saved. Silas taught her the art of timing in the field, how to move when the sheriff napped and where the deputy kept his spare key ring. She was practical enough to accept this education. He was humble enough to accept hers. Their planning sessions were practical, not theatrical. Maggie made lists and crossed out names, underlined what evidence needed corroborating, and predicted the likely counters. She sketched a map of Whitcomb's probable moves. Silas offered the timing. When they rehearsed the public revelation, he mimed the deputy's swagger for her amusement, and she, in turn, taught him how to soften his voice when he needed to gain the trust of a frightened woman who had been threatened into silence. When the deputy tried to frighten them with legal maneuvers questioning the authenticity of the ledger, Suggesting Maggie had forged entries, Silas did not bristle in fire. He found a route to expose the deputy's own complicity. He worked with a gambler who owed the deputy a favor to produce a scrap of correspondence that proved the deputy's acceptance of Whitcomb's coin. Maggie used that scrap as a keystone in her public case, not shouty or showy, but precise, like a scalpel. The sheriff could not so easily dismiss a pattern that included his own man. Their shared victories tightened not just the legal net, but their bond. He admired the way she cultivated allies, how she fed Mrs. Petrie's kitchen hands so they could come in confidence, how she gave a blanket to a girl who had no child's warmth to sleep under, small gestures that built trust. She admired the way he moved in the shadows with a quiet efficiency that never tried to make him larger than he was. They traded skills and, through trade, softened each other's rough edges. There were also moments where they healed each other's deeper hurts. Silas had a tendency to withdraw when past shame crowded him. He carried guilt for choices he'd made in younger, angrier days. Maggie, who had endured her own humiliation, learned to ask questions that were not condemning but offered a way to share the burden. She learned how to listen without fixing, to let him lay a memory on the table and live with it in the light. In return, he found someone who would be awake in the night to stand by the bed while she worried about the ramifications of exposing Whitcomb. They mended each other's ghosts by showing up. They also unspooled the myth that only male power could vindicate a woman. Silas never tried to take credit for the ledger's exposure. When a few townspeople tried to elevate him as the hero because he worked in the shadows, Maggie corrected them bluntly. He helped. I did the work. He grinned, not offended because he had no hunger for his own myth, when the justice they sought was the true prize. Their partnership was not an equal balance of showy roles, but a respectful calibration of strengths. She was the public mind. He was the operative. She chose the path. He stood beside her. Each complemented, neither completed. By the time they amassed enough testimony to force a county inquest, the town had shifted. Men who once shrugged now came forward. Women who once had been taught to be small stood with Maggie. Silas's role had become normalized within this new economy of justice. A man who had known how to get things done without being a bully. He had been taught by Maggie to listen. He watched as she delivered their case with the force of reason wrapped in the dignity of a woman who had chosen to be more than its servant. When they rode into town to present the ledger, they did so with the quiet confidence of two people who had remade themselves into a single force. She held the ledger still and steady as the clerk read aloud the entries that proved Whitcomb had been operating a web of favors and debts, while Silas stood with his hat pulled down, a rock and a witness. They were equal in the things that mattered: courage, commitment, and the willingness to stand in the ruin and rebuild. Their partnership shone because it had been earned and because it never pretended that one was less than the other. There are moments when the world narrows to a single fork in a road, and a single person must choose which path she will travel. That moment came to Maggie one late summer evening when the county court ruled that enough evidence had been gathered for an investigation into Whitcomb's dealings. Whitcomb, of course, did what men of his station do. He threatened. He hinted. He made his household stir like a hornet's nest. He threatened to sue, to push the law in ways that would make the next few months a grind of subpoenas and public spectacle. He hinted at violent retribution. The deputy, whose complacency had been exposed by Silas and Maggie, whispered that retribution in their house might look like an indictment of their own pasts. Maggie could have chosen safety. She could have taken Silas's offer and ridden for a distant town where his outlaw connections could cover their tracks and where the hollow shadows wouldn't reach them. Silence had been a refuge for years. She knew its contours and comforts. She could have let the ledger's pages collect dust in a safe trunk and allowed the sheriff's investigation to sputter without public pressure. It would have been a smaller life, but quieter. No court days, no whispering men, no offer of justice. The other path required her to step into the light fully. To follow it would mean mounting the public town square and putting her name to testimony that might get her ridiculed, threatened, or worse. It meant what she had feared most as a servant: to not be believed, to be painted as a troublemaker. But it also meant the potential to create a precedent, to chip away at a system that had taken more than it had given. To make a way for women who would follow her to have a firmer ground. It meant facing Whitcomb's wrath with a ledger in her hands and witnesses at her back. She weighed the choice not in a moment, but across a night. Silas sat across from her by the small stove, the lamplight catching the lines of his face. "We can run," he said quietly, as if offering escape were the most natural thing. "No one can force us to stay." Maggie looked at him, then at the pile of names she had gathered. Sarah's child's name written in a careful hand. Nell's scarred palm. Henry's trembling confirmation. She saw in those names faces who had no room to run. "We cannot make justice if we run," she said. "If we hide, it becomes easier for others to be taken. If Whitcomb is allowed to go unchallenged, those girls will be made to suffer in our absence." Silas did not try to analyze her into cowardice. He saw the value in her decision and respected it. "Then we do it your way," he said simply. "I'll be by your side." Choice made. Maggie let herself envision a different future for a moment, not as a fantasy, but as a plan. She saw a small house with her name on the door, a ledger kept of wages paid properly, a clinic where women could come without fearing they would be taken advantage of. She saw Silas by her side not as a guardian, but as a partner, sharing the chores and the hearth. She imagined them older, their hands marked by honest labor and other women coming to them for counsel. It was a life built on equality and choice, and the idea settled in her like a thing she had been waiting to claim. They rode into town armed with their dignity and their files. The sheriff attempted to use his authority to intimidate, suggesting Maggie had a ruined reputation and should abstain from public spectacle. Whitcomb's son shouted from the courtroom gallery, throwing insults like stones. Yet one by one the witnesses came to the stand and told the truth without melodrama, some with tears, some with a steady silence that was as telling as any outburst. The court listened because Maggie had prepared her case down to the last detail. The ledger's pages could not be denied. The evidence moved like a tide that pulled other things along: old grudges, men's silence, quiet complicity, in that crucible. Maggie's agency was not an act of defiance for its own sake, but a deliberate choosing. She chose justice over concealment. She chose truth over a return to the hollow. She chose a life where she would be more than someone who survived. Silas watched her with a kind of reverence that did not attempt to make her smaller or more heroic than she was, rather. He honored her decision by standing beside her without overshadowing her. When she walked out of the courthouse after a long day of testimony and cross-examination, a small group of women in the alley waited with a stew and an offer. "We thought you might be hungry." That quiet solidarity felt like a benediction. The choice had a cost. Whitcomb retaliated in small, cruel ways, refusing to sell feed to neighbors who aided Maggie, whispering slanders in the saloon. There were nights when Maggie woke with her heart pounding, when the deputy's smile looked too sharp. But there were also mornings when a woman she'd helped gave her a jar of preserves, or a boy she had healed at the cabin ran to her with a wildflower. In the making of her decision, Maggie discovered that courage has an economy. It spends itself sparingly and pays dividends in community. She had chosen a life made of small, brave acts. And in choosing, she had also chosen Silas. Not because he filled a hole, but because he chose the harder path with her. The human story is often a quiet accumulation of pressures until they crescendo. And that summer, the pressures against Maggie and Silas heightened into a storm. Whitcomb, humiliated and exposed, did not relent by law alone. He summoned the weight of social pressure and hired men who did not ask questions. The deputy, resenting the way the ledger had bit into his pride, used his influence to make daily life complicated. He pressured the market to refuse Maggie's wares, slowed down paperwork that would free witnesses from threats, and sent late-night reminders by way of threatening notes. Silas's past, too, returned not as a mere memory, but as a complicating factor. An old associate, Briggs, The man who'd never liked being told to sit on principle saw the newly exposed scandal as a chance to reclaim territory. Briggs intended to rob Whitcomb's money and leave the town in flames, thinking chaos might bring profit. Silas, who had once straddled that line of chaos and gain, refused to allow such wanton destruction. He warned Maggie that Briggs was moving up from the valley, a loose man with cheap violence. "He thinks this place is his for the taking," Silas said, the word taking sour on his tongue. Maggie refused to let Briggs become the town's excuse to revert to lawlessness. She feared Whitcomb's tyranny, but did not want the community's response to justify more lawless men. So she did what she had always done. She built alliances. She visited the women at the wash house and asked for their help in monitoring the roads. She asked Nell to keep watch at night and Tom Hargrove to place a hand on his rifle, not for jeering retribution, but to stop brigands who sought profit in shattered towns. She did not seek theatrical displays of force. She organized because she understood the cost of unbridled violence. Whitcomb intensified his campaign of quiet attrition. His men harassed those who helped Maggie. The stable boy was fired. Mrs. Petrie's cottage lost its coal on a winter's night. Yet, for each act of cruelty, Maggie arranged a small counterfood for the fired stable boy. A clandestine coal exchange organized through the trading post. It was not a romantic resistance. It was a pragmatic one. She began to see her role not only as an avenger of past wrongs, but as a steadfast coordinator of a community's moral center. The deputy tried to cut off her access to the county clerk, making it harder to file affidavits. He even attempted to smear her name by resurrecting the theft accusation with new false testimony from a man Whitcomb had paid. The court's process, meant to be an instrument of justice, threatened to buckle under influence. But Maggie had anticipated that. She had copies hidden in several places in Henry's desk and beneath the floorboard of Harlan's cabin. When one copy was dismissed as a forgery, she produced another, and when a witness wavered under fear, she brought forward a second someone who could corroborate with cold, unemotional details like dates and receipts. Briggs's arrival in town made things dangerous. He and his cronies were not merely out to rob. They wanted chaos. They intended to make the town's grieving of Whitcomb's exposure into a free-for-all. Their presence forced Maggie and Silas to reckon with new ethics. Silas proposed a preemptive streak-use force to drive Briggs off. Maggie refused. When she refused violence, she did not mean surrender, but strategy. Violence could solve a single night but ruin the town's moral fabric. She instead plotted a way to neutralize Briggs's threat without bloodshed, disrupt his supply, starve them of local support, and expose him to a house of townspeople who would not tolerate unchecked violence. Her plan required savvy and solidarity. She asked women who had once been on the periphery to step forward, the laundresses to watch the main road during night shifts, Mrs. Petrie to let them use her potato sheds as hiding places for supplies, Henry to record every suspicious trade at the post. They did more than help. They stood together in a way Maggie had never seen before. Women who had previously folded under the pressure of men's expectations now seized the power of collective quiet resistance. When Briggs's men came to the trading post, they found their coins short and the town ringed with eyes and faces they had misjudged as weak. It was in these days of conspiracy that Silas proved his loyalty in a way Maggie had not demanded. He chose not to retaliate with the old code of the outlaw. He used his knowledge to intercept Briggs's supply line instead. But in a non-violent manner, he took their map and rerouted their horses toward a bog that would bog them down, not hurt them. He sabotaged their plans in cunning ways that left them forced to leave town without igniting a war. Briggs slunk out, humiliated but alive, and Whitcomb's men, deprived of the chaos they'd hoped would restore their power, faltered the most dangerous pressure. However, was the social one neighbors pressuring friends to step back from helping Maggie? Because they feared being blackballed or losing trade? In that climate, Maggie's quiet attention to individuals kept the network moving. She bargained with what she could give: a sack of flour, a mending of a coat, a small healing. She built a currency of goodwill that could withstand Whitcomb's efforts to isolate her. when the deputy found a legal pretext to file a suit against Maggie herself for disturbing the peace during a public meeting, it looked like the last straw. He attempted to make her the criminal for daring to expose another man's crimes. But the town had already shifted its center of gravity. Men and women who had once been silent stood to testify to Whitcomb's corruption. The deputy's suit fell apart under the weight of community testimony and the multiple corroborations Maggie had carefully stored. In the end, it was not a showdown of fists, but of records and witnesses that broke the deputy's threat. Forces conspired to crush them: money, reputation, hired muscle butt. They met each scheme with strategy, patience, and unspectacular courage. Maggie learned that standing up to systemic pressure did not always look like a headline. Often it looked like sewing, bartering, listening, holding a hand when intimidation came near, and arranging for the safe passage of horse and ledger. She discovered that resilience could be ordinary and repeated, and that communal solidarity was a weapon Whitcomb had not counted on. Silas, watching the women who had once been invisible move like a tide against his old ways, felt a deep, softening pride in the way Maggie held the storm. Every story that rises finds a moment when the ascent falters, when what you have built feels like it might be taken from your hands. For Maggie, that hour came with betrayal, not at the hand of Whitcomb, but from someone she had once trusted, the stable boy. A lad named Eli, who had been present the night of Whitcomb's worst decrees. Eli had once been timid, pressed by hunger into complicity, and then warmed by the small kindnesses Maggie had offered. She had given him bread and taught him to not a halter, paid him in promises and in small, trusting looks. She had believed foolishly and humanly that kindness would outlast fear. But Whitcomb's reprisal had been patient and cunning. He found Eli's mother sick with a fever and leveraged the deputy's access to medicine to keep her alive only if Eli turned on Maggie. They forced him with a surgeon's blunt knife. Betray your protector or watch your mother die in a back room, while Whitcomb's pulse waited. Eli, in fear and despair, told the deputy where the ledger copies were hidden. The deputy, eager for his revenge and cover, planned a midnight raid. Maggie received word of the raid too late. She had been exhausted from a day spent shepherding women through affidavits. Silas had been on the road intercepting a man Whitcomb sent to buy off a witness. When the deputy's men stormed Harlan's cabin in the dead of night, they tore through trunks and sacks, slapped wrists, and broke the trust the cabin had held. They found the ledger's copy. They were not satisfied with paper. The deputy wanted blood. He took Silas into custody on trumped-up charges of theft and planning a town burn. It was a thin pretext, a tool of a man who had been humiliated. Maggie watched the men cart Silas off and felt the world tilt. The ledger was gone, her copies scattered. The women who had been aligned with her trembled like birds. Whitcomb paraded the raid as the justice of a man wronged. The deputy painted it as the simple enforcement of law. Maggie's heart did a strange calculation and found a different arithmetic in place. She could flee now, burn the roads behind her, reform herself in a new place. Or she could stay and be the anchor for a town that had begun to believe it could stand on its own. The choice felt like a cliff. Silas in the deputy's jail had little recourse but to wait. He had never wanted to be a martyr, but he had always refused to surrender when stakes demanded action. From the darkness of his cell, he sent Maggie a look, not desperate, but warm. "Do what you must," his eyes said. "I'll hold the line." Maggie refused to allow her story to be smothered by another man's guilt. She pulled together the last of her evidence, the fragmented letters Henry still had hidden, Mrs. Petrie's corroborating receipts, even Eli's own confession that he had been coerced. Eli broke down when Maggie confronted him, ashamed and raw. And she did something she had scarcely allowed herself before. She forgave him with the clear-eyed kindness of someone who could not allow another's pain to be weaponized. "You did what fear told you to," she said, "but you can tell the truth now." That truth became their lever. She filed an emergency motion for Silas's release, not with theatrical speeches, but with rock-solid testimony and an irrefutable trail of handwriting that proved. Whitcomb and the deputies planned to seize the ledger had been orchestrated. The county judge, who had previously shown himself susceptible to Whitcomb's gifts, had been nudged by the small but growing chorus of witnesses who had come forward in the weeks before the raid. Henry had copied his ledger pages in triple. Nell had sworn under oath. Several men who'd once been bought had returned the coin to Maggie with apologies and signed statements. Even so, the deputy used his authority to drag the case into the slow machinery of law. Silas remained caged for weeks as evidence was sorted and threats made. In that slow waiting, Maggie felt the fullest pinch of loneliness she had known since the Hollow. She walked the town with a ledger of people who were uncertain, some wishing to turn away rather than choose sides. Whitcomb leased his rhetorical power in the saloon and tried to convince men that Maggie was a disturber of peace, a woman who would unsettle the natural order of their town. It was at this nadir that Maggie found an unexpected and beautiful strength. The women who had been fed and healed in the cabin returned her the favors without drama. They stood at the courthouse doors carrying food and testimony. They told their stories. It was the kind of solidarity that could not be diminished by threats because it derived from necessity as much as principle. They did not wear signs or slogans. They came with their plain faces and their steady resolve. Their presence shifted the calculus. The judge, who had been leaning into caution, found his docket full of clear statements and a tricky public mood that included the whispered but palpable threat of a town rally. The deputies' claims, which had first seemed to paper over a miscarriage of justice, looked thinner in the bright light. The jail's logic buckled under the weight of community presence. In the end, Silas was released on a technicality. The sheriff could not prove the charge of theft without a witness who would not be discredited by Whitcomb's money. The ledger pages returned like a ghostly tide, some found in odd corners, some pieced together from Henry's copies. Maggie had saved them through patience, forgiveness, and the persistent work of building trust. The victory did not feel like a tidy triumph. It carried the smell of fear and the taste of loss for those whose lives had been bruised. But it gave them room to breathe and to rebuild. Maggie's darkest hour taught her what she had suspected, that courage does not erase pain. It chooses to keep standing despite it. It taught Silas that the outlaw's code of swift, violent justice could be traded for something more durable: truth and patience. Above all, it showed the town what women, acting together, could preserve. When Silas walked out of the jailhouse, unbowed though shaken, he looked at Maggie with a new kind of respect, one born of witnessing her refusal to back down when the very ground had been pulled from under her feet. True rising requires a plan as much as courage. Maggie chose not to lead an uprising of gunfire and retribution. She led a movement of precise exposures, public witnesses, and a carved-out legal approach that used men's documents, ledgers, letters, and accounts against them. The ledger that Whitcomb thought he had restored to sanity had become the instrument of his undoing. Maggie orchestrated the final moves with the confidence of a woman who had spent years counting what others overlooked. First, she organized the women into a small court of the public. They were not an actual court, but their collective testimony had the weight of a communal conscience. Nell, the laundress with the scarred hands, was prepared to tell the story of unpaid wages and threats. Mrs. Petrie agreed to confront the local grocer, Whitcomb stooge, with receipts that could not be denied. Henry the clerk agreed to testify to the accuracy of his copies. Each witness would be unimpeachable because each had nothing to gain, right? Everything to lose by lying. Silas took a role that fit his qualities. He would guard the perimeters and intercept any attempt to intimidate. But he would not have the center stage. Maggie insisted on transparency. "If we win, it is on our terms," she said. "We cannot let as men claim the method we use as an excuse to say the ends justify the means." Her plan involved multiple fronts. While the women prepared their testimony for the county hearing, Henry printed copies of the ledger and passed them discreetly to traders and small-town newspapers who cared for the truth more than for Whitcomb's coin. The ledger's details were indisputable: dates, signed receipts, and a pattern showing how favors had been used to grease the wheels of corruption. They could not easily claim forgery when so many had touchstones that confirmed the ledger's validity. They also needed to neutralize Whitcomb's allies. Maggie and Silas orchestrated a sting that was cunning rather than violent. They used Henry's copies to bait a conversation between Whitcomb and one of his deputies, a recorded setup using witnesses to be at the right coffee shop at the right time. They did not steal or threaten. They recorded evidence of Whitcomb warning his men about the ledger and offering hush money. The spectacle was less a burst than a slow unpeeling of the truth in front of witnesses who would later testify. The day of the county hearing arrived with low, patient sunlight. The courtroom was packed, not with men waving hats in bravado, but with townspeople who had been fed and healed and promised honesty. Whitcomb strode in as a man who expected to muscle a legal matter into his favor. Instead, he found a ledger, Henry's corroboration, Nell's voice, and a swarm of quiet women who had become the voice of the town's conscience. Maggie was not alone up there. She wore the faces of all the women who had little claimed but everything to lose. Whitcomb fought. He called witnesses, sued for slander, and tried to make the ledger look like a forgery. But the careful planning Maggie had done copies in multiple hands. Corroborations by independent traders and the deputy's own typed letters unraveled each of his claims. He could not withstand both law and the moral pressure of a town that had tasted the injustice. When the judge finally read the evidence, it was not a speech of triumphant vengeance, but a crisp accounting of the truth. Whitcomb's holdings were bound up by the court. He was fined, and the county ordered a full audit of his dealings. The final act did not lock every wound. The deputy managed to escape direct legal ruin, but was publicly shamed in a way that affected his standing. Whitcomb's attempt to preserve his dominance eroded in the presence of a community that had seen the ledger's truth. The trickle of people who had once been impressed by his coin had begun to see him as a man. He used his wealth to buy silence rather than to administer justice. When it was over, Maggie did not stand triumphant in a theatrical posture. She sat on a bench outside the courthouse with Silas, who had remained largely silent during the proceedings, watching with something like recognition as neighbors stopped to shake her hand. She felt weary and relieved in equal measure. The ledger had been a weapon, a truth, and finally a bridge to the life she wanted to build. People would still have to sign paperwork to make Whitcomb accountable, and the law would have to do slow repairs. But the tide had turned. Her rise was not absolute. She still feared being reduced to the hollow shadow on bad nights when the wind cut a familiar path. But she had more than fear. She had choice. She chose to reclaim the Hollow House property her husband had once owed as a claim. And the court's audit revealed Whitcomb had overstretched his holdings. A small tract of land, just enough for a home and a garden, was awarded to Maggie to repay some of what had been lost to James's family. It was not a fortune, but it was her own. When they walked out of the courthouse, a small group of women followed them, offering pies and well-worn blankets. They sang no songs of revolt. They offered the ordinary comforts of a town. Maggie began to plan what she would do with the land. A small home with a clinic in the back where women could come without fear. An herb garden she had already imagined. A ledger on the wall where wages were kept fair. Silas stood at her side, not as a husband yet, but as a companion, whose share in the work had been real and whose willingness to place himself in service of her choices was the truest declaration of love he could offer. Through the victory, something else also rose. Other women? The girl who had been compelled to sell herself for favor now had a place to stay. The laundresses felt emboldened to insist on wage contracts. The midwife who had kept her head down now ran a small birthing circle with Maggie as her counsel. They started to meet weekly in Maggie's future front room, talking about plans' rights and how to teach their children to count wages fairly. Maggie's leadership was not vain or solitary. It was an organizing force for a town that had been used to men's dictation. As for Silas, his past did not vanish, but it found a channel. He began to work as a courier for legal papers, using his knowledge of secret routes to aid lawful business instead of a legal profit. He learned to trade his cunning for reliability, and in doing so, he found a peace he had not expected. Their romance matured in the calm between events, no fireworks, but a slow building of trust, shared chores, quiet evenings by chores, laughter at each other's fumbling with domesticities once foreign to him. Maggie rose not as a myth, but as a living, breathing force in the town, a woman who had been wronged, who had refused to be silenced, who had assembled the courage and the community to set things right. She had led without having to become something she was not, had made choices that were strategic and moral, and had built a life that looked toward a future she would shape. She had saved herself, and in doing so, she had helped to save a town from the corruption that had nearly devoured it. Triumph in Maggie's account was never an altar to personal revenge. It was a measured, legal, and communal reclamation of dignity and fairness. After the court ordered Whitcomb's audit and penalized his holdings, the ripple effects were practical and profound. Whitcomb's influence in the market dwindled as traders no longer trusted him to settle accounts honorably. Men who had once depended on him had to find new patrons. And in many cases, they found the independence Whitcomb had prevented. The deputy, exposed for taking in illicit coin, lost his position. He shuffled out of town with his reputation as a cautionary tale. But justice had to be constructed, not merely declared. Maggie insisted on that. She did not allow the matter to be resolved through hushed settlements or whispered apologies. She wanted the deeds found, the wages restored, and the law made to do the work for those who could not threaten. She led a coordinated effort to ensure Whitcomb's laborers were paid back wages where possible, and that signatures and receipts were corrected in public records. She worked with Henry and a visiting county auditor who had the grit to see things through. There were small, stubborn battles. Whitcomb contested the costs, appealed decisions, and tried to use the length of legal process as a smothering cloud. He hoped to drown the case in delays. Maggie countered with diligence. She and a team of townspeople converted a back room at the trading post into a record center, where women like Mrs. Petrie could come to check the accounts. They taught a small class on keeping receipts, on how to demand a signed ledger for labor, and how to reclaim an unpaid day's wage. Maggie found creative ways to restore independence to those affected. She helped the laundresses set up a coop to negotiate their own rates, negotiated to become a collective supplier for the nearby mines, and ensured they had a seat at the market's negotiation table. The result was more than money. It was a permanent shift in local economics. The women gained bargaining power, and the town gained an ethic that counted labor for its worth. Trust in institutions, once wobbly, began to mend. Silas's redemption paralleled hers, but never overshadowed it. He reconciled with the town not by pleading, but by consistent acts that required patience and humility. He returned some of the goods he had taken in old work and arranged for small returns or compensations where possible. He became a courier who specialized in sensitive deliveries, legal documents, medical prescriptions, tasks that required discretion and trustworthiness. He built a reputation slowly, as one who could be relied upon for the right reasons. People came to see him as a man remade by choosing to serve the community's needs rather than his own appetites, their romance, if one could call it that, in the market of mature affection that had grown between them, softened and steadied. They shared chores and late-night talks about how they would run the small clinic on the land she had reclaimed. Silas would tend the gate and ride to town for the weekly market. Maggie would tend the herbs and keep the books for those who needed fair accounts. They spoke of the future in terms of practicalities: fences to raise, seed to plant, a ledger to keep for wages that would be held in trust. Their love was not a rescue. It was an agreed partnership where each had a name and a job, where each held the other's wounds without pretending to own the other. The town, too, changed. The laundresses and midwives developed a weekly meeting that doubled as a town council on matters of labor and family. They instituted a small fund to help women who had no recourse in emergencies and established rules about hiring and wage contracts that, while not perfect, set a new standard. Maggie became a figure that others sought out, not because she wanted accolades, but because people recognized the strength of someone who had used orderly methods to claim Just as that, there were moments of tenderness that felt like punctuation in the long sentence of rebuilding. Maggie fixed a girl's dress at the county fair with the same precise hand that had once mended the ledger's margins. Women lined up to get her advice about coping with unjust employers. She led a small evening circle that taught bookkeeping and legal literacy for women, an idea that came from a woman who had been a servant and had learned that the armor of knowledge could be as sturdy as the hide of a horse. The final confrontation, when it came, was not cinematic in its violence, but in its decisive legality. Whitcomb, pressed by the court and public opinion, consented to a settlement that included a public apology and restitution where possible. The county replaced him in certain civic roles and barred him from presiding over any labor disputes. The deputy, left with no support, sold his badge and left town with his reputation in tatters. It was not an ending swept in brown victors riding into sunset, but it was a dismantling of corruption and the building of a more honest community. For Maggie, the triumph was private and public in equal measures. She secured a deed to a modest parcel of land enough for a house with a back room for a small clinic and a ledger shelf, where residents could come to ensure fairness. It was a quiet enough victory, not grandeur, but autonomy. She used part of the restitution to fund a co-op and to provide small loans to women who needed new starts. She did not squander her triumph on revenge. She spent it on infrastructure for dignity. Silas asked for nothing formal at first. He preferred to stand in the doorway of her life and make small offers. A hand on a chilly morning. An errand taken. A protective distance maintained not as possession but as respect. But as the town stitched its new patterns, he proposed to her not a demand, more a request. In the way men who have learned humility ask, "Will you share this life with me?" he said, hands not overbearing, but open. Maggie considered the offer with that same ledger sense of weighing assets and liabilities. She saw a future that included him, not as a rescuer, but as a partner who would wake at dawn, who would help tend the fence and the ledger, who would sit with her in the evenings and listen when the townswomen came with their small stories of trial. She said yes, not because she needed him to complete her, but because she chose him as someone she trusted to stand beside her in the world she had laboriously remade. Their marriage, when it came, was a quiet affair in the town chapel with a breakfast afterward. That included every woman who had testified and every man who had changed his ways. It was not a triumph of romance, but of partnership, honest, considered, and mutual. They went on to live a life that was as much a testament to their cooperation as it was to Maggie's fierce independence. She did not become someone else when she married. She remained the same, determined, practiced woman who had used her own strengths to save herself and hold the town to a higher standard. Years settle over people like dust that eventually becomes part of the landscape. Maggie's hair carried a few silver threads, and there were lines around her eyes made by laughter and long watches under the lamplight. She had a small house on the lane that led out of town toward the open prairie house, with a low porch where lavender grew thick and bees hummed their honest work. Behind it, a modest clinic sat with knitted curtains and a ledger hanging above the counter where wages and small loans were tracked with precise handwriting. She kept the ledger in a shape that made it useful. Neat columns, dates, signatures. It was a practice she taught in the weekly women's circle. They'd bring problems big and small, and Maggie would fold them into practical solutions. Women learned to ask for receipts, to insist on signed agreements, to understand the value of their labor. There was a small library on the shelf, law pamphlets, household finance guides, and a worn copy of a book of herbal remedies that had been given to her by Silas on the night he proposed. It was the kind of library that read like a toolkit for adulthood. Silas kept watch in the perimeter like a gentle shepherd. He was no longer an outlaw in the law books, though everyone knew his past. He was now the man who could be trusted with sensitive letters, who would ride to neighboring towns to collect old signatures, who would ferry prescriptions for children too ill to travel. He bore his old scars with a quiet dignity, and he listened more than he spoke. An attentive partner. Their life together was a negotiation of roles that fit their temperaments. Silas repaired fences and mended tools. Maggie tended herbs and ran the legal literacy circle in the evenings. When mothers came in with babies, it was Maggie who would take the child's temperature and soothe their fever with poultices she made herself. Silas would arrange a place for the mother to sleep if she had no place. Or he would go fetch Henry to notarize a piece of paper. The work was shared not by default, but by choice. They financed the cop of laundresses and seamstresses with a small fund Maggie had set aside from the restitution. The coup provided advances for women who needed maternity help and tiny loans for those who wanted to start a hawker's stall. It was underwritten by careful audits and the kind of pragmatic thrift that Maggie had hammered into being. It featured a small room where girls could learn to read and write, an idea Maggie had fought to incorporate because she knew the smallest literacy could protect a woman from a lifetime of exploitation. The town changed under their slow stewardship. Men who had held power for decades found themselves answering to committees where women had a voice. The weekly market reflected negotiated prices rather than dictated ones. The county clerk, once pliant, now had a desk full of receipts and a new respect for the way women organized themselves. It did not erase every inequity, but it shifted the balance in practical, long-lasting ways. Female solidarity made itself visible in the small and ordinary. The midwife who had been timid once now ran birthing lessons. The laundress who had been the first to testify taught others the economy of a cope. When Whitcomb's family attempted a comeback by quietly returning to the town's periphery with new money, they were met not with a vendetta but with a community unwilling to be console-bribed back into old servitudes. The Whitcombs found alternative work and the dignity of men learning to negotiate fair deals. It was a small, imperfect victory for the entire town. Maggie's physical appearance evolved with her life. She traded the patched dress of the Hollow for practical clothing she sewed herself. Well-fitting trousers for fieldwork and a heavy apron for clinic duties. The linen carried the smell of lavender rather than kitchen smoke. The women in the town admired her, not for the prettiness of these clothes, but for the way they fit her shoulders, designed to hold work rather than hide it. Her movements were sure. She walked like someone who owned the ground beneath her feet. It was a visual testament to the life she'd engineered. One where function and dignity mattered more than the performative sheen of male approval. Symbolic objects crewed around her. The ledger in the clinic. A cedar walking stick James had carved years before and which now rested by the door. And a small iron ring, once a horseshoe nail, Silas had forged into a pendant and given to her on the night they first decided to trust one another. Each carried a memory. Each was a mark of ownership over her life that Whitcomb's men had tried to take. Her influence extended beyond a small town. Women came from other places seeking advice, strategies for dealing with employers, or simply wanting to hear a story of someone who had turned the wheel. Maggie never preached. She told the truth plainly. Yes, you will be fearful. Yes, there will be setbacks. Yes, you must choose your battles and build allies. She taught them to keep ledgers and receipts and to name their worth. More than one woman left with a borrowed book and a map in her pocket of where to find legal help. Silas thrived in the rhythm that grew out of their choices. He learned to plant a garden that Maggie had chosen. It's a strip of lavender and rosemary that made their porch smell like a steady future. He took the role of guardian not to a woman's independence, but as a companion and partner who allowed her to be both softer and fiercer. He learned to listen to the Women's Council and take direction when asked. This gave their relationship a beat of respect that matured with each shared task. There were still hard days. Winter would bring illness and money worries, and there were visitors who tested old habits. But these were faced together. Maggie could call on the community they had helped cultivate. Silas could ride to neighboring towns for supplies. Friends would knock on the door with bread. The life they had built together was not utopian, but it was honest and chosen. The legacy Maggie hoped for: practical independence for women, a community that measured people by the fairness of their dealings, and a love made of mutual respect began to show signs of taking root. Girls who once thought the only path out was marriage or servitude could now see the paths of trade and legal knowledge that Maggie had helped create. They grew up watching a woman their age, perhaps even older, who had been wronged and had fought back without losing her dignity. That was the model she offered. You do not have to be young to begin again. You do not need permission to claim your portion of life. And when nights came, Maggie and Silas would sit on the porch, their hands entwined, heads close enough to talk in the low voice of familiarity. They would watch the prairie breathe and count the stars with the calmness that belongs to fatigue, paired with satisfaction. She would often pull a worn ledger from its shelf and show a young girl how to balance accounts. And when the lesson was done, she would tuck the ledger away and hold Silas's hand for a while longer, both of them content in the quiet that followed hard work. And so her story ends where yours continues. She was told she was broken, but she proved them wrong. She was left for dead, but she rose stronger. She was meant to be silent, but she roared. If you're a woman who's been knocked down but refused to stay down, if you believe that it's never too late to reclaim your power, if you know that the strongest love is built between equals who lift each other up, then you've found your tribe. Subscribe to witness more legends of women who refused to be victims, who turned pain into power, who wrote their own endings. Like this story, if you believe every woman deserves a second chance at happiness on her own terms, share it with every woman who needs to remember her own strength. Hit that bell, sister, because these stories aren't just entertainment, they're reminders that you're stronger than you know, braver than you believe, and deserving of a love that sees you as the hero you truly are.